My dad wanted everything. The judge, his friend, said I had no value as a witness. I bent to the mic and said a single call sign. The color drained from his face. The gavel slipped from his grip. How do you know that name? His power was gone. The judge leaned forward, his voice oozing with a smug finality. The witness has provided no evidence of financial acumen or frankly, any real-world value. Her testimony is irrelevant. My father, Richard, a ruthless real estate mogul who saw people as assets or liabilities, nodded in agreement from the plaintiff's table. A cold calm settled over me as I leaned toward the microphone, my voice even and quiet. With all due respect, Your Honor, my value is in assessing threats. For example, I understand the significance of the call sign Vesper. The courtroom was silent. Judge Carmichael, an old friend of my father's whose loyalty was thicker than his law books, went pale. The smirk on his face didn't just vanish, it was wiped away, replaced by a mask of pure terror as his hand began to tremble. The gavel slipped from his grip, clattering against the polished wood. How do you know that name? He stammered, his voice a choked whisper. It had all started 2 weeks earlier in that very same room, during the preliminary hearing. The air was thick with tension. The dispute centered on the estate left by my late mother. My father was petitioning the court to place my entire inheritance into a trust managed solely by him. His argument was simple and humiliating. I was naive, irresponsible, and fundamentally incapable of managing my own affairs. And Judge Carmichael, acting less like an impartial arbiter and more like my father's personal counsel, was more than happy to help sell the narrative of my incompetence. He openly mocked my quiet nature and what he called my vague, low-level government job. I can still hear his condescending drawl. Ms. Sterling, your father built an empire. You, on the other hand, seem to file things. Am I getting that right? My father's laugh boomed through the chamber, a sound of cruel victory. I watched the court stenographer flinch, her fingers pausing over the keys. In that moment, I added this humiliation to the internal ledger I kept, right next to the missed graduations and the condescending pats on the head when I tried to explain my work. But this time was different. A quiet, cold fury began to burn through the fog of old wounds. This wasn't just another family dinner where I could retreat into myself. This was a court of law. This wasn't just a dismissive comment. It was a judge, on the record, officially belittling a federal employee to discredit her testimony before it was even given. He was so sure of his power, so certain of my weakness, that he had carelessly documented his own bias for the entire world to see. My father's laughter filled the courtroom. He thought the judge had handed him his victory on a silver platter. He had no idea that Judge Carmichael had just created a public record of judicial bias, giving me the legal grounds to introduce evidence from a world he didn't know existed. To understand the trap I was about to set, you have to understand the two lives I was living. My father's perception of me was a carefully constructed fiction, a story he told himself and everyone else so often that it became their reality. To him, I lived a small, gray life. To me, I was living a double life, and the chasm between the two was a universe-wide. It was never more apparent than at family gatherings, which were less about connection and more about performing for an audience of one, my father. I remember last Thanksgiving with painful clarity. The house was filled with the scent of roasted turkey and my father's expensive cologne, a suffocating combination of comfort and control. At the head of the long mahogany table sat my older brother Mark, the family's golden child, whose charm was as polished as the expensive shoes my father bought him. My father stood, glass of wine in hand, to propose a toast. His voice boomed with pride as he detailed Mark's latest achievement, closing a minor commercial lease for the company. You would have thought he'd brokered world peace. The family applauded, their faces beaming. It was just another Tuesday for Mark, but my father framed it as a monumental victory, another brick in the shining legacy of his chosen son. Later, during a lull in the conversation, I tried to share a piece of my own life. I mentioned quietly that I had just received the director's citation for excellence, a significant commendation in my field. My father, in the middle of a conversation about market caps, paused. He turned to me and gave me that familiar condescending pat on the head, the one reserved for a child who'd brought home a crayon drawing. "Oh, that's wonderful, honey," he said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Another gold star for your collection." Then he turned right back to the adults and their important discussion, dismissing me completely. The sting of it was sharp and immediate, another entry in the long internal ledger of 1,000 similar cuts. A few minutes later, he gestured to me while speaking to a cousin. "That's our little G woman over there," he said with a chuckle, and the table laughed along. A cute, harmless nickname that felt like a cage, reducing my entire world to a punchline. Now, contrast that memory with my reality from the very next day. I was not in a warm wood-paneled dining room. I was deep inside a SIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility. It's a place with no windows, where the only sound is the low hum of servers, and the air tastes like cold, filtered electricity. The walls are built to block any and all signals from getting in or out. In that room, I wasn't little G woman. My call sign was Pathfinder, and I was the lead analyst for Operation Nightfall, a multi-agency task force targeting a web of international financial corruption so vast it threatened to destabilize entire economies. My audience wasn't my dismissive family. It was the Deputy Director of National Intelligence, General Evans, a stern four-star general who commanded armies and had the president's ear. He stood with his arms crossed as I pointed to a complex chart on a large monitor, my voice the only one in the room. I wasn't shy or quiet here. I was the authority. The SIGINT confirms Vesper's reporting, I stated, my tone level and confident. The shell corporations are using the same encrypted backchannel as the Cayman account. We have a clean pathway to the source. I saw the data not as numbers, but as a narrative of greed and crime, and it was my job to read it. General Evans listened, his eyes fixed on the screen, absorbing every word. He didn't pat me on the head. He didn't call me cute. He simply nodded, the highest praise you could get from a man like him. Proceed with the trace protocol, Miss Sterling, he commanded quietly. My office will provide top cover. In that silent, sterile room, I had more power and respect than my father or brother could ever comprehend. I was not invisible here. I was essential. This was the duality I lived in, the chasm between the daughter my father saw and the professional I actually was. And now, in this legal battle, he was trying to use that twisted perception as a weapon. He dared to stand in court and invoke the memory of my mother, a woman of quiet strength and fierce intelligence whom he had systematically underestimated his entire marriage. His lawyer's arguments were filled with phrases like, honoring her wishes, but I knew the truth. He twisted her memory into a tool for his own greed. Your mother knew you couldn't handle this kind of pressure, Sarah, he'd said to me with feigned concern before the hearing began. She would want me to protect you, to protect her legacy from your instability. The word hung in the air, a deliberate and cruel choice. He was painting me as fragile, as broken, all to get his hands on what was rightfully mine. He wasn't protecting her legacy. He was trying to steal it, just as he had tried to suffocate her spirit when she was alive. For my entire adult life, I had kept my two worlds separate to protect my family from my reality. Now, to protect my mother's legacy from my family, I would be forced to merge them. They only understood the language of money and power. It was time I showed them what real power looked like. That night, back in my sterile apartment that felt more like a barracks than a home, the hot shame from the courtroom finally cooled into something else. It became a cold, hard resolve. The emotional pleas I had rehearsed in my mind, the arguments about fairness and my mother's true wishes, they were useless. Dust in the wind. My father and Judge Carmichael operated in a world of leverage and loopholes, not love and respect. Trying to appeal to their hearts was like trying to appeal to a spreadsheet. There was nothing there. So, I made a decision. I would not fight them on their emotional battlefield, a field they had mined for years. I would not try to convince the judge of my worth. I would force him to acknowledge it. My goal wasn't revenge, not in the way my father would understand it. It was simpler. It was a procedural correction. I would use the rules of his own system, the very laws he swore to uphold, to make my position undeniable and his untenable. The next morning, I sat with my lawyer, a quiet but sharp woman who understood discretion. We drafted a motion. It wasn't aggressive or accusatory. On the surface, it was a simple formal request, the kind of boring paperwork that clogs up the legal system. We were petitioning to introduce a sealed federal case file as evidence of my professional responsibilities and fitness of character. Specifically, Case File 71 CR 994, designated Operation Nightfall. It looked like a desperate Hail Mary, but I knew that specific file number, once entered into the court system, would trigger silent alarms all the way up the chain of command at the Department of Justice. It was a digital tripwire. To be certain, I made one call. I used a secure line to contact a liaison in my agency's legal counsel. I didn't ask for a favor or for anyone to bend the rules. I asked a single, precise, procedural question. If a judge presiding over a civil matter is named as a person of interest in a sealed federal investigation, I asked, my voice steady, what is the protocol for a witness with direct knowledge of that investigation? The lawyer's reply was crisp and immediate, devoid of any emotion. The witness is obligated to report the potential conflict of interest, M.S. Sterling. Failure to do so is a breach of federal code. Your motion to introduce the case file is the correct and necessary first step. The system will take it from there. The trap was legal, ethical, and perfect, and it was set. The motion was filed, a digital bombshell sent through official channels. My father and Judge Carmichael would see it as a desperate, amateur move. They had no idea they weren't just being served a legal notice. They were being served a summons into my world. The day of the final hearing felt like a change in atmospheric pressure. The air in the courtroom was thin and sharp, charged with a tension that only I seemed to fully appreciate. My father, Richard, sat at his table, projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable confidence. He caught my eye as I walked in and gave me a slow, pitying look. The kind one gives a wounded animal you know is about to be put down. He saw my motion to introduce evidence as a pathetic, desperate act. He thought he was about to witness my final, public humiliation. I let him think it, let him enjoy these last few moments in the world he thought he controlled. Judge Carmichael was already on the bench, holding the pages of my motion between his thumb and forefinger as if they were contaminated. He radiated an annoyance so profound it was almost theatrical. He was a king in this little courtroom kingdom, and I was a peasant who had dared to question his decree. He cleared his throat, letting the silence stretch for an uncomfortable length of time before beginning, his voice dripping with a sarcasm so thick you could taste it. "Ms. Sterling," he began, glancing over at my father with a conspiratorial smirk, "the court has received your unusual motion." He paused for effect. "Before I dismiss it as the frivolous document that it so clearly is, perhaps you can explain to us what a low-level analyst could possibly know about a sealed federal case?" He winked, a tiny, almost imperceptible gesture, but it was a signal to my father that the game was already won. My lawyer tensed beside me, but I placed a calming hand on her arm and stood. I walked to the witness stand with deliberate, even steps. I could feel every eye in the room on me. My father's full of smug pity. The judge is full of scorn. They expected me to stammer, to cry, to crumble under the weight of their authority. I did none of those things. I simply sat, adjusted the microphone, and waited for him to finish his performance. He saw my silence as fear. It was focus. The judge leaned forward again, ready for the kill. "Well, Ms. Sterling, the court is waiting." I looked past my father, past the lawyers, and focused directly on Judge Carmichael. My voice when I spoke was not loud, but it carried through the silent room with absolute clarity. "I wasn't just an analyst on Operation Nightfall, Your Honor." The judge's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. A tiny crack in his perfect facade of control. A flicker of confusion crossed his features. "I was the asset handler," I finished. The air shifted. The confidence in the judge's posture deflated just a little. He was no longer playing to the gallery. He was listening. He was off script now, trying to process this new variable. He still believed I was bluffing, that I had picked a title out of a hat to sound important. He tried to regain control, to expose my lie. His voice was sharper now. A weapon instead of a toy. "The handler for whom?" he pressed, his eyes narrowing. "You can't just throw around titles like that in my courtroom, young lady. Name the asset." This was the moment. The culmination of a lifetime of being underestimated. The final entry on the internal ledger. I held his gaze, refusing to look away. I let the silence hang in the air, a heavy blanket of anticipation. Then, I leaned into the microphone. "I was the handler for the primary confidential informant," I said, my voice dropping slightly, forcing him to lean in to hear me. "The one whose testimony formed the basis of the entire investigation." I paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. "You might know him by his call sign, Vesper." It happened just as it did in the hook. The blood drained from Judge Carmichael's face, leaving behind a waxy gray mask of pure terror. His breath hitched. It wasn't just a name to him. Vesper wasn't just an informant. He was Judge Carmichael's own personal financial advisor, the man he trusted with his darkest secrets. The same man he had personally recommended to my father, and a dozen of their other powerful, corrupt friends. In that instant, the judge understood everything. He understood that the quiet, useless woman at the witness stand didn't just know about the investigation. She held the keys to the entire sealed indictment against him. My father's face was a canvas of slow, dawning horror. He looked from the judge's terrified expression to my calm one, the gears grinding in his mind. Vesper, his financial advisor, a federal informant. The name meant that his own meticulously hidden accounts, his dirty deals, his entire fragile empire, were now the primary subject of a massive federal corruption probe. His power, his money, his legacy, it was all compromised. As if on cue, two stern-looking individuals in impeccable dark suits, who had been sitting quietly in the back row, stood up. They weren't theatrical. They were simply present. And their presence was a signal that the rules of the game had just irrevocably changed. My father had spent his life building power with money and influence. In the end, it only took one word, one name from my world, to tear his entire kingdom down. The silence that followed the single utterance of a name was more profound than any shout. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air and arrogance out of the room. The two men in suits moved with a quiet efficiency that was far more terrifying than any overt display of force. They didn't run. They simply walked to the side of the bench and had a hushed, intense conversation with the bailiff. There were no handcuffs, no dramatic scene. Just the calm, methodical dismantling of a man's entire world. Judge Carmichael, looking a decade older than he had 10 minutes ago, stood on trembling legs. He couldn't look at me. He couldn't look at my father. He just stared at the wall behind the gallery, his face a mess of shame and terror. He announced his recusal due to an unforeseen conflict, his voice a hoarse, broken thing. Then he turned and walked into his chambers. Not a judge anymore, but a defeated man shuffling off to meet his fate. I looked over at my father, Richard. He was left sitting alone at his table, a captain on a ship that had already sunk. His expensive lawyers were whispering frantically to him, but he wasn't listening. He was just staring at the empty judge's chair, the full scope of his catastrophe finally dawning on him. I stood up, my own lawyer giving my arm a small, triumphant squeeze. But I didn't feel triumphant, I just felt quiet. The fight was over. I walked out of the courtroom without a single backward glance. The inheritance, the money, the entire reason for the lawsuit. It was all secure, but it had long since ceased to be the point. I wasn't walking away with a victory. I was walking away with my freedom. 1 year later, the view from my office is different. I don't look out onto a suburban street, but over the sprawling landscape of Washington, D.C., the air here is different too. It's the air of consequence, of responsibility. The plaque on my door is simple, etched in clean block letters, Sarah Sterling, Section Chief, Counterterrorism Finance. It's a title I earned, not one I was given. I was in the middle of a briefing for my new team, a group of brilliant, hungry analysts, outlining a complex network of dark money flowing through Eastern Europe. My voice was the one I'd found in the skiff, confident, authoritative, and respected. I moved through the data with an ease that came from living and breathing it. From the back of the room, General Evans, the deputy director himself, observed. As I concluded my presentation, he gave me a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. It was more valuable than any inheritance. It was acknowledgement. It was respect. After the briefing, my team didn't scatter. They gathered around the briefing table, asking intelligent follow-up questions, debating methodologies, and even making a few inside jokes I was now privy to. There was an easy camaraderie here, a current of mutual respect that flowed between all of us. We were a team, bound not by dysfunctional obligation or a shared last name, but by a shared purpose. These people were my true family, a family I had chosen, and one that had chosen me back. This was the legacy my mother would have wanted for me. Not one of wealth, but one of worth. A life built on competence and contribution, surrounded by people who saw me for exactly who I was. Later that afternoon, back at my desk, an email notification popped up on my screen. The sender was a ghost from my former life. My father, Richard. The subject line was just 2 words, "Please call me." For a long moment, I just stared at it. A year ago, that email would have sent a jolt of anxiety or anger through me. It would have meant a sleepless night, a storm of conflicted emotions. Now, I felt nothing. It was like looking at an artifact from a forgotten war. His power over me was gone. The time for words, for explanations, for apologies that would never be sincere. It was long past. My peace was no longer a negotiation. It was a fact. I moved my cursor over the message, and without opening it, I right-clicked and selected Archive. The message vanished. I turned my chair back to the large glowing monitor displaying a global threat matrix, a world of complex problems that needed solving. My work, my purpose, my peace. My father believed a legacy was a name you put on a building. I learned a true legacy is a name whispered in fear by the corrupt, and in respect by those you protect.